The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
Hi there, and welcome to the Cipher Brief studio. We are on the road this week. If you've been listening to the Open Source Report podcast, you know that already. It's so nice to be back here with you, though, and I'm here with our COO, Brad Christian, to talk about a very important issue of disinformation. We're so pleased that we were able to get this whole panel back together. We did this session at South by Southwest in Austin this year, but we felt like the issue was too important to only provide for folks who had a ticket or the ability to attend South by. So that's why everyone agreed we needed to come back together and have this conversation with a much broader audience. We had more than 500 people register to attend today's session. A lot of you are Cipher Brief members. We welcome you back. And for all of those who are not Cipher Brief members, we welcome you as well. So with the evolution of technology, I think many of you would agree that there's been a breakdown of trust in once trusted institutions, and US adversaries are now creating their own facts. They're pushing them on an unwitting, mostly US public, and we wanted to really come together to discuss how lessons learned from the intelligence community can help all of us find a new path to truth. Three women with deep experience within the IC are joining me to tackle this topic today. But before I welcome them, I just want to note that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had many of us kind of glued to our devices. I am no exception. We all want to know what's happening out there, and information is coming in so quickly, literally minute by minute, literally conflicting reports on almost everything every day. It's very difficult to know what's true and what's not, what we should be sharing, liking, getting other people in our social circles to read. There's just so much that's coming out. It's difficult not to hit that share button. As we sit down here today with these three women who rely on critical thinking to keep the country safe from national security threats, we're going to focus on what they know about how to identify and mitigate the threat of disinformation. We thought we might begin, though, by illustrating the problem quite literally. So before I welcome our guests, I'd like to share with you a short film produced in cooperation with two of today's guests, as well as another former CIA officer, that sets up some key definitions of what disinformation is that we're going to be using during today's conversation. So let's take a look at that video.
Today, we have access to massive amounts of information. And while this has clear advantages, there are also more serious consequences at play. The constant barrage of information makes it much easier for countries to wage disinformation campaigns. And nothing less than our democracy is at stake. Imagine a scenario with a fictitious country called Trebolonia. Instead of engaging in direct conflict, they want to weaken us from within. They know a vibrant democracy depends on access to good information and healthy debate, so they set out to spread false or misleading stories online. This is called disinformation, and your emotions are the weapon of choice. We're all prone to confirmation bias, interpreting evidence in a way that supports our existing beliefs. Knowing this, Trebolonia targets any group with firmly held opinions, regardless of partisan leanings. They fabricate stories that tap into our fears and anxieties. Not knowing they're inaccurate, people share the misinformation with an intent to inform others. Aided by technology that shows us what we want to see, this soon creates echo chambers, where we're only exposed to one point of view. We develop an us versus them mentality and see each other as the enemy. Trebolonia doesn't care about either side of the debate. It simply wants to divide us and weaken our country. They know a house divided cannot stand. Human nature makes us all susceptible to disinformation. We're all prone to misjudgments. So how can we protect against the threat of disinformation and ensure that we're relying on trustworthy reporting? First, check your emotions. This could be an initial red flag. Is the story eliciting a strong emotional response? Is it playing into your biases? Second, check your evidence. Read deeper than the headline and avoid quick judgments. Research alternate explanations and consider other points of view. Finally, check your sources. Who is the author? What is the source of the original information? When was it published? And why are they publishing it? Does the author have an incentive to manipulate the truth? Following these simple steps can empower us to fight disinformation and help us build a healthier democracy together.
Let's go ahead and welcome our guest today. It is my great pleasure to welcome the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Dr. Stacey Dixon, former Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, Ellen McCarthy, and former Senior CIA Analyst, Teresa Smetzer, to the Cipher Brief studio. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's so nice to have sort of everybody back together on this issue. You know, spies are trained to question everything. They're trained to avoid confirmation bias, which we heard about in the video, which is what we want to hear, really, and instead uncover truth. So I'm really anxious to talk about what everyone can learn from spies and how to uncover this truth and why it matters. Dr. Dixon, thank you for being here. I wonder if you can start off by telling us a little bit about your career in the intelligence community, and then talk to us about how the government sees the disinformation threat and what it's doing about it.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's so great to be here and be with the panel again. I have been in the intelligence community nearly 20 years, and right now I am the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, which is the #2 in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which looks to oversee and integrate the 18 elements of the intelligence community. I previously worked as the Deputy Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, who is the one responsible for analyzing the satellite and other imagery and geospatial information. I've worked as the Director and Deputy of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity, which was looking at high-risk, high-payoff research, and started my career as a CIA engineer working at the National Reconnaissance Office building satellites. So happy to be here and happy to touch so many different elements of the IC. Your question, disinformation, in national security. And disinformation is a problem, and not just for the intelligence community, but really for all of us. Disinformation introduces distrust. And distrust, of course, is when you doubt the honesty or reliability of something or regard it with suspicion. Distrust in the government gets in the way of citizens believing the government. It gets in the way during critical moments like crises involving public safety, when we really need the public to trust what the government is saying. Keeping the public safe requires the government, the public, and institutions all working together. For example, we all know when there's an Amber Alert and a child is missing, that's a time when we need to come together. When there's a safety recall for a toy or a piece of furniture, that's another time when we need the public to listen to the government. When there's a food or medical device recall, because there's an issue that could be fatal if unresolved. In all these situations, we need the government and the public to work together, but the public must trust the government for the warnings to be heeded. Excuse me, sorry. In this country, the democracy that we're in, we get to choose. We get to choose whether we listen to the warnings. We get to choose whether or not we think the government is there to be of help or not. If there is distrust in the government or the news sources reporting the information, it's less likely that those warnings will be followed, which means there's a higher likelihood that more people will get hurt, even when it was preventable. In the intelligence community, uncovering the truth and informing U.S. policymakers is at the very core of what we do. Policymakers rely on us to deliver objective and independent analysis, and our credibility depends on them relying on us. And this is core to our intelligence community values, which are excellence, respect, integrity, and courage. U.S. policymakers rely on the intelligence community to inform them of or answer their questions about what's happening in the world. And if they don't trust the intelligence community or its methods, policymakers may doubt the information that we try to provide them. They might look at sources to which they're more comfortable or have more trust to educate them on a matter, which we think is making them more susceptible to disinformation. However, because so much of what the intelligence community does is in secret, Those who need our information to help them understand what's happening in the world really must trust us. And because there is so much information, they rely on our expertise and our expert analysis to provide, and our expert and analysts to provide them very reasoned judgments about the different situations in the world. Our analysts, in turn, offer their best insights to policymaker questions. In addition to needing policymakers to trust the American public, the intelligence community also needs the trust of the American public, and the government needs the trust of the American public. Our intelligence officers practice what we call analytic tradecraft, which includes using structured analytic techniques that help us challenge, refine, and then challenge again the mental models that we all use to process all the information that's always constantly coming at us. Our analysts identify relevant, credible information to pierce the disinformation that can be spread by foreign states or non-state actors. They're ever cautious of fabricated, false flag evidence, things or events that are created to look like they're coming from one country when they really are not. They are also looking to analyze competing hypotheses. So it's not just one. They look at many different ways of looking at the same information. They try to draw reasonable inferences from that, and then when they reach conclusions, they go back again and they reassess how they got to that conclusion. They do all of this by trying to remain very, very aware of the biases that they have. They also apply very contrarian techniques, so always going back to question the final conclusions that they draw. We rely on them to be very, very self-aware, because being self-aware helps preserve that analytic objectivity. And they're trained to know and practice that the most powerful antidote to biased thinking is really seeking a diversity of thought, diversity of perspectives, and really leveraging the strength of all the disciplines of the intelligence community. And that's signals and images and measurements and signatures, superhuman sources and open sources, and geospatial information to kind of paint that picture. Now, your other question, Suzanne, was what is the government doing about disinformation? And I will give you an intelligence community example. We use a variety of approaches across the 18 elements of the community to address. I want to be very, very clear that we're not assessing a particular narrative or conducting a purity test of the message. Instead, we're assessing whether a foreign actor is using that narrative to alter a target, in this case, an audience's attitudes or behaviors, to benefit that foreign actor. Fostering trust with the public is critical. And when the IC has information that it believes can be used to inform the public and help them avoid making decisions based on disinformation, it's important that we share that information where we can, as long as we continue to protect our sources and methods. And we can look at some really recent examples of the intelligence community in identifying disinformation in the conflict that you raised at the beginning regarding Russia and Ukraine. We applied our analytic tradecraft to assess the ground truth of what was really happening, and also saw and identified Russian disinformation. We then used standard classification procedures to go through and see how we could protect the sources of message and still provide the information for the policymakers that they could then share with the world. And two specific examples are as follows. As the buildup happened, as we saw 100,000, 150,000 of troops amassing around the border, Russia's explanation was that these were exercises, but we knew that this was an exercise like we had never seen before. We collected information that detailed the movements and the continued presence of Russian troops around the Ukrainian border, even after Russia said that it was moving away from the border. Our policymakers shared these details with the world, which helped people question what they were seeing and what they were hearing from Russia. Russian media also spread false alarms and claims to try to maximize public outrage so they could then justify their invasion. And the IC provided warnings of that to policymakers, who then also shared that with the world. Russia was trying to use that as a pretext to justify their invasion on Ukraine. Our intelligence suggested it could be something like a staged atrocity that they blamed on Ukraine, or a fabricated terrorist event that they blamed on Ukraine. Either way, blaming it on Ukraine would then give them the justification that they needed for war. By sharing this with the world, we were able to at least take away the lies that Russia was going to use to justify the invasion. And although it did not actually stop the invasion, it did help the public be aware that there was this disinformation that was being shared. It made them more mindful of what they were actually watching and what they were seeing. Our aim, to be clear, in providing the declassified information was not for the public to do anything with it. It was just really for the public to have that skepticism when they heard these claims, so that they could judge for themselves what they were hearing and what they were seeing. When Russia's aggression towards Ukraine ends, we're going to have to go back and take a look at how this declassification of information really impacted things, how it changed what we were doing in the community, how it impacted and changed the outcomes that our allies and partners undertook, how it even make sure that we went back and looked and saw that we were protecting sources and methods. That's what I've got for you today, Suzanne. I will turn it back over to you.
I appreciate that, Dr. Dixon. I think it's really insightful, especially since a lot of what you talked about we have seen sort of playing out. We've seen the release of this intelligence information. So it's something that we know is happening. I appreciate your comments. Ellen, you served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. You've also worked in the private sector, and you have a keen understanding really of how information is used in multiple environments. Can you tell us a little bit about your intelligence community background and then share some insights with us about what you've learned about information and disinformation and what you think the private sector can and should be doing about it?
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and thank you for hosting this with Cipher Brief. I'm so glad we get a chance to replay the South by Southwest panel, because I really think it was just a great success. So I started in the IC back during the Cold War, and I was a submarine analyst at the Office of Naval Intelligence. So I was tracking Soviet submarines. Over the course of the years, heck, I followed Stacy around. I was at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I have been at USDI. I've run a nonprofit that brings the public and private sector together. That was a very eye-opening experience, getting a sense of what an incredible role the private sector plays. Ran a for-profit, learned how to make money. But this topic has just become such a passion for me, and it really is based on my time at ONI during the Cold War, and then my time at INR in the last administration, and just thinking about how much things have changed. I'm so passionate about this subject that now I'm in the private sector again. Didn't want to leave, but had to leave because politics ruled the day. And I'm so passionate about this that I'm starting a nonprofit that really is focusing on truth in media. We're calling it the Truth in Media Cooperative, and I hope to talk about that another time. But just based on that experience, there's 3 takeaways. And they really mesh nicely with what Stacy mentioned. My first takeaway is, and this really was based on the Cold War versus today, that the IC is just not as integrated with its clients today as it used to be. And we have competition, and that competition is in the private sector, but competition can be a good thing. So this is not about being a bad thing. The second point is there's a serious absence of public trust in government and in the private sector and media organizations. Again, I think Stacy did a bang-up job of talking about how important it is to trust the government, to trust the IC. And my last point is that, and an optimistic point, is that the private sector is actually perfectly poised to do more in this realm, to self-organize and to take on Trouble-onia. So focusing on my first point, that the IC is not as integrated as it used to be, and that we have this competition. When I started during the Cold War, there really just wasn't as much data then as there was today. Tracking Soviet submarines, I would report to the Chief of Naval Operations, or later on to Special Mission Units down at Submarine Forces Atlantic. I got my information by working with the collection system and tapping into national technical means, and that was images, and that was signature intelligence, and communications intelligence, and electronic intelligence, ELINT. And I put that puzzle together. There was some unclassified sources, but for the most part, we were working with national technical means, which meant that information needed to be protected, especially since there was nothing else like it in the private sector. So I was very much focused on sharing, but also protecting. And our analysts at those days had the best tools. They were the best state-of-the-art tools and technologies when you look at the 80s and the 90s. Our customers or our clients in those days were the president, the policymaker, the war fighter, and the law enforcement official. And in my career, I've had a chance to work for all of them, with my last job being support to the policymaker. We were highly integrated. Info, for the most part, and intelligence was shared during a morning briefing. Everybody went there, or it was shared in hard copy via a leather-bound briefing book or in a message. And the content delivery system for our intelligence, for the most part, worked. You know, the operators would rarely make decisions. The policymaker would rarely make decisions if they didn't tap into their intelligence. I'm not sure that's exactly the case today. There's certainly huge pockets where that's the case today. But certainly based on my experience at INR, we just weren't as integrated as we were back in 1947. And it's a double-edged sword, because as the world has gotten more complex and dangerous, and in my view, intelligence is more important than it ever is before. Every issue that the president deals with is an intelligence issue. I think our intelligence community has just grown in importance and in value. But the other side of this problem is that there's more data. You know, now the digital age has provided much more data. But the other side of the sword is the private sector has adapted to that increase in data in terms of developing tools and technologies. And while I think the IC is definitely moving in that direction, there's certain elements that are still operating with that old content delivery system of leather-bound briefing books. And that just means we're not, you know, unless we're sitting in the room, we're not doing the things that we need to be doing. I'll tell you, at State, our clients attended the morning briefings. Our analysts were everywhere giving them the intelligence, but if they didn't like it, you know, they had this private sector entity that operates on a 7/24 news cycle. And you know, some of those sources were not so good. And some of those sources were actually pretty good. I mean, you look at Bellingcat's reporting of poisoning in Europe, and there are some very good sources. Again, getting to that double-edged sword. An interesting story when I was at State was, I can't name the issue, but I had one assistant secretary who was so concerned that the intelligence wasn't correct, that I would get barraged with reports that he would look up. And then I give it to the analyst, and the analyst would say, no. And it's not. And then I'd go back. And even after I left government, I would still get emails saying, are you sorry you criticized the president? You know, that question just confounds me, because you know, the intelligence community is not about, it's not about criticizing, it's about truth to power. It's about providing information, as Stacey's, as she's highlighted our tradecraft. It's about delivering information about how the world is today. You know, I'm not surprised that policymakers would feel the way they do, and I learned this at State because policymakers really see the world as they want to see it. So it was always a little challenging, you know, trying to share with people who didn't always want to see the truth, but figuring out ways to get it to them. So then I leave government, I come to the private sector, and I'm not at all surprised that, you know, if you've got people in government who are not trusting the intelligence community, or not hearing what they want to hear, or going to information that's now readily available. Again, the private sector has embraced the digital age, and now there's all sorts of data and information that's available to our clients in the IC. And if they don't believe in the intelligence, there's lots of other places they can go much more easily. They don't have to go to the morning brief. They don't have to get that leather-bound briefing book. They just go on their phone. And so I'm not surprised at all that in the private sector you would see, you know, the same thing, where we're just deluged with data. We can't process it, so we just tend to look at things that feed the narrative that we have in our head. My second point is government organizations and sources of information are no longer trusted by so many people across the country, and that really scares me. And again, I'm going to reiterate a lot of the points that Stacey made. You know, we as a country are in this incredibly complicated, integrated global enterprise, much more so than when I started in the 80s, where things just seemed much more black and white. I'm not sure they were, but that's how they seemed back in the days. Now we've got these ginormous issues like healthcare and climate change and pandemics, and then, you know, competition from China and Russia, what's going on right now. You know, these problems are just not black and white. And, you know, so how do you deal with China when our economies are so incredibly integrated, but we clearly don't share the same worldview? And how do you deal with these problems if you don't trust one another? You know, we have to at least be operating off of this solid foundation. We don't always have to agree. But if nobody trusts even that foundation, if nobody trusts the media if nobody trusts social media, if nobody even trusts the IC, how are we possibly going to have an intellectual debate inside our country, much less across this global universe, about these big problems that we need to work together? The RAND Corporation, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization, launched a study a few years ago, and they put out a book that reviewed that study called Truth Decay, an initial exploration of the diminishing roles of facts and analysis in American public life, by Jennifer Kavanaugh and Michael Rich. I know you've covered this before with your folks, Suzanne. I've read it. I highly recommend it to those who haven't read it yet. I mean, I think it provides probably the clearest review of this blurring of facts and opinion, of cognitive bias, of misinformation, it changes in our information system, which has resulted in this erosion in civil discourse, political paralysis, disengagement of people from politics and civic institutions, and just uncertainty over our policy. And it really highlights that if that's what we are experiencing right now in our own country, we're really a petri dish for the Russias and the Chinas of the world to just sort of continue lobbing in mistruths, untruths, and lie to just get things all riled up. It just feels like Trebolonia is winning. But this is where I'm going to get to my third and final point, and it's far more optimistic. We in the American people have all the tools we need. The private sector has very much embraced the digital age. We have everything we need. The one benefit of being out of government is I can speak openly. I believe that the IC should be supporting the American people in addition to all those other clients. And I think we're seeing this right now. I can't be more proud of Dr. Dixon and Avril Haines for the courage that it has taken to actually release the information that they're releasing. I've never seen it before across my career, that level of transparency. And the risk, the IC is pretty traditionally risk averse, but this is a risk. This is compromising sources and methods, especially with a guy like President Putin, who's pretty familiar with intel and covert operations and is pretty good. This was a real risk, and I think it just shows how incredibly important it is to get the truth out there. And so I want to thank them for that. I would like to see more of it. And I am glad to see there's a review. This is where I'm an intel person, so I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I just don't think it's going to happen at the rate that it needs to happen. But whatever that is, it's not a completely bad story, because the private sector has everything it can do to self-organize and to start becoming more hungry for the truth. And the best part is you don't have to be an intel analyst. You don't have to go through a polygraph. You can carry your cell phone anywhere. You can wear your slippers to work. In fact, the only thing that separates the private sector from an analyst at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research is the kind of data we work with, who we serve, and training in critical thinking. And, contrary to popular belief, when I started, we really relied on national technical means and the need to protect information. And while I still believe that we need to protect intelligence, there has been a bit of a paradigm shift. Amy Ziegert wrote a book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. Again, I know you've talked about this on Cipher Brief. Fabulous book. I've got it dog-eared and I've got notes in it. I would encourage folks to read it. And I'm using Amy. I think she's a reliable source who highlights that today intelligence reports are not as dependent on classified information. Her number is roughly 80% is based on publicly available data. And so when it comes to analyzing that data, you really don't have to be an I&R analyst. None of us on this screen were born critical thinkers. We were trained to be critical thinkers, and you can too. That training is not magical. It's not classified. The same tradecraft that Stacy's analyst uses every day to find a target, you can use to help you form an opinion on COVID or climate change or whatever the issue is. I think the video did an incredible job of laying out what it takes to be a critical thinker. Just to reiterate a couple points: thinking rationally, not on emotion, self-awareness about what your assumptions are. Don't just read things that feed the narrative in your head. Open-mindedness, remain open to other people's assumptions. Don't discount these unpopular views. Learn more about them. Try to understand why someone is forming the opinion they have. You know, the first thing I do every morning, I've joked about this, I love Wordle, so I'm a Wordle freak. It's literally the first thing I do in the morning. But the other three things I do is I read 3 different publications, the Washington Post, Fox, and the BBC. Triangulate, you know, read at least 2 or 3 different sources and make them very, very different. And finally, and most importantly, please, please, please do not post anything on social media if you've not done all of the above, because that's how misinformation really spreads around. I mean, social media is perhaps the biggest culprit. And if you do these things, Trebolonia loses. So thank you so much.
I love that. Thank you so much. I think you're absolutely right. I think no one really teaches you how to go about doing this. So I appreciate the practical application of reading more than one source. We've all seen what's happened when people don't do that in the last 4 years, and how divided you become, and you just get even more emotional. So thank you very much, Ellen. That was great advice. Teresa, you spent the bulk of your career at CIA, where you worked on all sorts of issues, but you also had a focus on technology and how that impacts the agency's mission in finding truth. Tell us a little bit about your experience, and then I'd love to know how you think that same technology that is making this so easy for US adversaries may also be able to help us guard against the disinformation threat.
Great. Thanks so much, Suzanne, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So just by background, I've spent some 30+ years in the intelligence community, including 2 distinct tours at CIA. In between those tours, I was with a number of companies, including my own management consulting company, all aimed at providing technology or innovation solutions to the intelligence mission at many of the organizations that are part of the IC. Early on, I started my career at CIA as an intelligence analyst, and I still feel like that's my primary competence, if you will, as an analyst. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of the most daunting professional experiences I've ever had, which was serving on the White House Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the US regarding weapons of mass destruction, better known as the WMD Commission, or more commonly known as the WMD Commission. This commission was formed in 2004 as a result of the controversy surrounding a 2002 national intelligence estimate that falsely came to the conclusion that Iraq was continuing to produce WMD in spite of UN resolutions. This controversy has sparked many, many reviews over the years as a result of the false outcome. But at the end of the day, there were really kind of 3 interrelated points along the analytic pathway that led to that outcome, and they're all quite relevant to the topic at hand today. The first was that the analysts didn't really place their analysis in the strategic political context of what the Iraqi government's plans and intentions and motivations were at the time. The second was the analysts assumed that Iraq would hide their WMD programs because that's what they'd always done in the past, just sort of a classic mindset challenge. The third was perhaps the most significant, in that there were a number of human source reports that indicated that Iraq was still producing WMD. Well, upon further investigation, it turned out they all tracked back to one source, a fairly sophisticated but known fabricator. And so, you know, my panelists have talked about analytic tradecraft and critical thinking, and the importance of both of those in avoiding bias in your thinking process. Well, what this WMD estimate shows is that even experts who are well-trained can make mistakes. We're all prone to bias of one way or another. And so it's just something to sensitize yourself to. The good news with the IC is they really, as a result of that estimate, doubled down on the training and development of tradecraft and so on to make sure that something like that never happens again. So that was 20 years ago, when a lot has changed with respect to the amount of data that we're dealing with, the emergence of technology, the global complexity that we have to deal with every day. But the story is really quite relevant to the topic of disinformation and misinformation. The second point I want to make is the challenges that we face with respect to misinformation and disinformation are likely to continue to grow and to become much more complex. Use of social media and online fora of a variety of types are proven very useful in transmitting false information, and will continue to proliferate because the users, whatever their message is, whatever their agenda is, broad range of actors find it quite useful. And so when you think about it, the use of those platforms really has two fundamental drivers: influence and money. First slide, please. So the Global Information Index identified some 20,000 websites that are known to publish misinformation. And on those websites, advertisers spent some $235 million a year advertising, despite the misinformation. This is not surprising when you think about the Pew Research study that was done in 2016 that showed that the majority of US adults, some 65%, access their news via social media. So advertisers advertise where they know that people are looking, which is the social media or the online fora that we're talking about. Beyond the money-making benefits, which are significant, terror organization and our adversarial nation states find great utility in using false news to perpetuate their particular agenda, regardless of what it is. Next graphic, please. In 2018, Science Magazine published a study that showed that false news spreads in Twitter much faster than other types of news and has greater impact. In fact, tweets with false content were 70% more likely to be retweeted than information that's true. So what this graphic shows on the right is that the orange cloud is the false information that's perpetuated or retweeted, much greater than the blue information or green information on the left, which is truthful information. This phenomenon has been studied extensively, and there are lots of motivations and reasons why false information is published more readily, but this is a pretty alarming piece of data. Making the environment even more complex is the sheer magnitude of data, news, social media that everyone deals with or is deluged with on a daily basis. So distilling truth really requires that you identify and dismiss false information, misinformation, questionable information, or just plain opinion in the quest to find the truth. Next graphic, please. I love this next graphic by domo.com, which shows, it's really overwhelming. It shows in 2021 just how much digital information is created in 1 minute. It's enormous when you look at the totality of the way this graphic represents. I'll highlight a few facts just for context. In 1 minute, there's 65,000 Instagrams, 2 million snaps, 575,000 tweets, and Facebook users post some 240,000 photos. That's an enormous amount of data, and that's just a subset of the total information. Next graphic, please. Last but not least, IDC projects that by 2025, we'll have 175 zettabytes of data in the global data sphere. So what's a zettabyte? Well, for context, 1 zettabyte is roughly 3 million copies of everything that's in the Library of Congress, including text, digital images, web pages, and files that have multiple media types. So enormous amounts of information. So what these graphics are meant to indicate is that the volume, velocity, and variety of data that we're all deluged with every single day, it's not possible to use the same mechanisms that we've used even 5 to 10 years ago. It's simply too much data, and it's really quite overwhelming, particularly if your objective is to find the truth. That's enough on the graphics, if you like. The third point I want to make, which is on a more optimistic note, is that emerging technologies, in particular artificial intelligence and machine learning, is definitely helping us to deal with this problem. And so that's a positive story. Machine learning has been around for decades, but it's really only been in the last 5 to 10 years that machine learning was advanced enough, we had enough data, there was enough compute, the algorithms were advanced enough to start to have practical applications. And that's what we're seeing now, thankfully. Data science is a critical companion to the machine learning technology, and that we need data scientists in the workforce to help us make sense of all the data, to feed the models in an appropriate way. Some of the ways in which machine learning is used in the intelligence business include identifying disinformation. We can use machine learning in a variety of ways to accomplish that objective. Understanding anomalies based on what we've seen in the past, what is something that looks anomalous in the future? Generating insights from data, particularly unknown unknowns, where you don't know that you should be concerned about something because you didn't know there was a relationship. So there's a lot of promise, I think, in the machine learning in the future, and definitely today. So the government, the IC, and the government writ large has spent a lot of time and effort the last 4 or 5 years looking at machine learning. Our government research organizations, DARPA and IARPA, have spent a lot of time and money and intellectual capital pursuing advances in these fields to help essentially figure out the truth. And that's all very promising. Perhaps most importantly, in my view, is the private sector is investing enormous amounts of money in advances to artificial intelligence. In 2021, in the US, VCs spent an estimated $70 billion on artificial intelligence. They're projected to invest some $310 billion by 2026. So the impact is that all of us, whether we're in government and government servants, or whether it's us as civilians, or citizens, you're gonna start to see more capabilities, tools, techniques, methodologies to help us make sense of data and not rely totally on our kind of human instincts. Unfortunately, the bad guys have access to the same technologies when it comes to artificial intelligence and can use it against us. So there's a whole field called adversarial AI that is really meant to address how do we also detect when others are using it against us. But I think generally the US is in good position to help really mitigate that particular challenge. So from my perspective, at the end of the day, I think technology is definitely going to help us, but it's really incumbent on each of us as individuals to apply critical thinking skills, to understand the enormous amounts of data that we're confronted with, and to consciously think about our biases, and to consciously expand our awareness to consider other perspectives, particularly if our objective is to get at the truth. So, thank you very much.
Teresa, thank you. I think you hit on that very important point, which is technology is both adding to the problem, but also a big part of the solution when it comes to this. But you also hit on something that is core to this whole conversation today, which is you have to take measures into your own hands to be able, is a very different threat that way. Each individual has to be responsible for not allowing disinformation to be effective, and that's hard. So I want to talk about some very practical steps that we can take to mitigate that spread of disinformation. Dr. Dixon, what advice do you have on that?
I'll reference, thanks Suzanne, reference back to the video and the first bullet they made that was check your emotions. Knowing that disinformation is going to play on your emotions, knowing that it's trying to get you riled up, trying to get you to feel a certain way. If you are having a reaction, an emotional reaction to something, I'm asking everyone just pause and try to figure out what is it about your beliefs that's being triggered with whatever it is that you're seeing. And then think about it before you share it, especially, and consider the fact that someone may actually be trying to manipulate you to have the reaction you're having so that you will then further broadcast that. So back to what you said, what can you do as an individual? Know yourself, and if you're having an emotional reaction, pause before you act on it.
That's great advice. Ellen, what advice do you have for how we can help protect ourselves from this?
You know, what I loved about that video was it took the personal aspect out of it. You know, everybody believes in the truth. We all think we believe in the truth, but I think the video put it in terms of, you know, but we are getting taken advantage of based on sort of this environment that we're in right now. To Teresa's point, tools will help, but they're not quite, you know, they're not integrated at scale. And so what I would say is to recognize that we are this petri dish for misinformation, and to arm ourselves by educating ourselves, join efforts to learn more about misinformation and disinformation. I highlighted the RAND Foundation, but there's the Aspen Institute. There's the Disinformation Project, which is really about arming our kids, you know, highlighting to them the importance of critical thinking, the importance of news literacy, the importance of civics. And so I would say it's worth it. It's worth taking the time because I think we can defeat Trebolonia, and it's worth that effort.
Mm-hmm. Teresa, what practical steps can we all take?
So from my perspective, for everything you read, check the sourcing. Is the author credible? Has the author ever written anything that's relevant? Or are they somebody that's fictitious altogether? Have they produced credible information in the past? Are the timelines historically accurate? Do the images track with the story, and are they real? So many images now could be easily generated from synthetic means. There was a story recently with the Ukraine situation where there was a video of a Ukrainian soldier parachuting in, and all within days on TikTok, within days they had 20 million followers, and the commentary was along the lines of, "Oh, bro is filming the invasion," you know. It's and then, but when you clicked on the image and looked at it, it was from 2016. So it generated a lot of buzz, but it really wasn't even relevant to the issue at hand. So check your sources, whatever you're doing.
Great advice across the table here today. Let me get to some questions because they're really good ones, and we only have just a little under 10 minutes left, so we're going to have to be a little bit quick with answers on these. But here's one. One of our viewers is interested in hearing comments about deep fakes. What is the U.S. government specifically doing, Dr. Dixon, to combat and mitigate deep fakes? Because they're only going to get better with the application of AI, which I think we all believe.
I'll go ahead and take a stab, and I'm sure Teresa also has something to add on this one. You know, we're certainly aware of the challenge of deepfakes. We have researchers who are not only experts in AI, but also looking at those sort of adversarial techniques and how they may be made, and looking for ways to be able to detect that there has been some sort of manipulation to the images or the video or whatever the item is that you're talking about. So yes, they're always going to be there, and we're always going to be trying to defend against them. And as we defend against them, those who create them are going to figure out new ways to create them. And so it's this cycle where they will continue to get better, unfortunately. But we are aware and tracking and want to make sure that we're providing to policymakers and anyone who relies on our information the fact that something is fake or something is not. That is something that we try very hard to make sure that we're trying to differentiate.
Yeah, I think this is a really unique challenge too, because once you sort of see an image of someone you may know and trust saying something that they're not actually saying, but that's burned into your memory, almost like, you know, the way jurors are only allowed to believe certain evidence that comes through. Well, all those filters are gone when it comes to this issue. Teresa, anything to add on deep fakes and how you think that's going to be impacted in the future?
Yeah, I would say that's a great example of where investments in the research and development and government community, and there's actually commercial reasons why detecting deep fakes is important too, that we're going to see things emerge, tools or techniques that will help everybody in detecting images that aren't true. In some cases, it doesn't matter. It's just a marketing thing, but in a lot of cases, it matters a lot. So technology will help us on this one.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question, Dr. Dixon, would it be beneficial for the IC to develop a strategy for communicating with and cultivating trust in the American public? We've long had a culture of secrecy. The viewer says this is new territory for us. And Ellen, you and I have talked about this before. I think Jim Clapper, the former DNI, had actually suggested the idea of having some sort of government clearance center for some of these issues. Is that something that's on the table?
Absolutely. We've actually focused a lot on transparency, and we created a site called intelligence.gov, to which we actually declassify some of our analysis. If not the entire report, it would be the executive summary of it and put it on there so the American public can see some of the things that we've worked on, as well as to better understand the methods that we use. So we are trying, still trying to protect sources and methods, but we are trying to provide more of our reporting, more of our products, so that the American public can actually see them through our transparency efforts.
Mm-hmm. Has the U.S. experience with Russian disinformation positioned it to advise other countries on how to combat foreign influence operations? And Ellen, maybe you can tackle this for a second, because this is a uniquely connected threat. What starts as disinformation in one country doesn't stay in that country, and you've seen that through both your government and private sector career.
Yes, I mean, I'll say that. So looking globally, every country has sort of a different worldview, and they have a different goal. I mean, we just happen to be this petri dish for it. So I think if I'm understanding the question, I think there are many countries, China, Iran, that all have sort of different goals, and so they sort of lob these little disinformation nuggets out into social media with different. With the same outcome, with the same desire, which is to just sort of get us all riled up. I think it was happening before. I think there's just some countries that are better at it. I mean, I think Russia in particular has been very good at it. They've been doing this since World War II. But others are definitely learning from their tradecraft, but it's always with a different end goal in mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a question for anyone as well. When do you think that students should start to be taught critical thinking? And have you thought about ways to convince people that there are ways to embrace critical thinking techniques that aren't terribly difficult?
Preschool. I mean, I have 4 kids. I think the time to start teaching kids to think on their own is obviously in an age-appropriate way, but that little, because it's important for their development as a human, irrespective of the disinformation problem, that they learn how to think for themselves and how to consider information and determine whether, if their friend says, oh, it'd be a really good idea to get drunk and, cross the bridge, in the middle of a snowstorm or whatever, they need to think about that, right? So I think it can't be too soon. And I think it's really a kind of critical societal issue that we help kids at all levels learn how to think more critically.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add on to Bruce's point, I think also then it's educational institutions, media organizations, identifying ways that make people hungry to get the truth, and make it something that you want to do. You want to take the effort to learn more about a particular issue. So it's almost making truth cool, making it interesting. Going back to the Schoolhouse of Rock days, where you wanted to learn more about conjunctions and the government. And so it's how do we present truth in a way that is exciting and compelling?
It's almost like having a Peace Corps, but really focused on truth detectives, I think is a good way to put that, Ellen. Okay, very last question, and we've got a roll here, but program manager for Apple, Tomez, joins us. Hey, Tomez. Amy Ziegart's latest book, which you mentioned already, Ellen, discusses that the IC needs to view the private sector as a customer in addition to the traditional policymakers. Do you all agree?
I do.
I think that so in our goals now to kind of declassify information and provide that to the policymakers to share, one of the audiences certainly is the private sector, whether it is the direct customer or one of the sort of the customers by extension. We have to recognize that they are a customer. I'll have to think about it a little bit whether I think it needs to be a customer in terms of the the priority ones that we are chartered by law to actually explore.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just to add on that, I think it's more everyone as a customer, as an individual, and as a citizen of the United States, not necessarily as the company they work for or whatever their professional avocation. That's kind of a separate issue in my opinion. But from a personal perspective, everybody should be a customer and should learn from what intelligence has done and why it's relevant.
I think this has been a great conversation and one that really does need to continue. I know that we have all talked about that. We talked about that with a group at South by in Austin this year, and I'm sure there will be continuing conversations among the group that has joined us here today. I'd just like to give any of you the opportunity for any closing thoughts before we go.
Let's continue the dialogue.
I
This
just-
is an important topic that we need to figure out how to work on together, and there's no right or wrong answer. This is going to take, I mean, this is a fundamental societal issue, as the video showed at the beginning.
Yep.
And so this isn't just a government issue. This is an issue for all of us.
Great.
So partnerships between the public, private, academia are extremely important. And whatever we need to do to increase those partnerships, increase the trust is what we need to work on.
Yeah, well, I'd very much, Ellen, did you have any kind of parting thoughts?
Well, I'd add on, and it kind of gets to your question about private sector as a customer, but I think it's also private sector as a producer. There's so many places where you can get truly insightful analysis, and maybe if we can have a discussion about how we leverage that so that we don't have to repeat it, so we don't have to invest finite resources in things that are already being done in the private sector. We invest those finite resources in the intelligence that's truly exquisite and needs protection.
Yeah, I'd really like to thank all of you for being a part of this, for making this a priority, and for sharing your truly unique insights into this issue. I want to let everyone know that the video that we showed off the top is posted at the Cipher Brief YouTube channel. You can Google it, you can share it, you can take it, you can post it on your own websites. I think the goal here really is to get everyone thinking and everyone talking. So again, big thanks to our very distinguished panelists today, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Dr. Stacey Dixon, the Honorable Ellen McCarthy, and Teresa Smetzer. Ladies, thank you so much for your time and your focus on this issue.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for being here as well. We appreciate the questions and we look forward to continuing the conversation. I'm Suzanne Kelly here with Brad Christian. We'll see you at the next Cipher Brief event. Take care.
Bye-bye.